a new quarter in our study, and that leads us to 1 Corinthians. So we're moving quite a bit away from Esther, all the way to the New Testament, to not quite to the book of 1 Corinthians. So if you turn there, hold up just a little bit, because this first introductory lesson is not actually from the book of 1 Corinthians, but a little bit of an introduction to 1 Corinthians from the book of Acts, chapter 18. So, there are, or at least an hour or so ago, there were some books left on the table. If anybody needs one, be sure to get one for this quarter and especially for today. But like I said, we're going to be in Acts chapter 18 to look at more or less the background and the beginning of this congregation. 1 Corinthians is a letter, one of Paul's letters to the church, a specific congregation in the first century. And we can learn quite a bit from Paul's letters to churches because we are also a church. And while we may not deal with exactly the spot on exact issues that another church might deal with, the issues that we face, there are only so many. So we will, at one point or another, every congregation will probably have to deal with the same general kinds of problems. So anytime that Paul wrote to a congregation in the first century, there's something for us to learn and take from in the 21st century. So during Paul's second missionary journey, of which there were 3 recorded in the book of Acts. During his second one, which is generally considered to be his most prominent, he went to Macedonia. In fact, I think maybe a good time for this. Paul went to Macedonia, which is across the Aegean Sea. So he started in Antioch, Syria, which is where he always started. That was sort of his headquarters. He and Barnabas had, in the first journey, gone through the Mediterranean Sea and gone this way and then gone up to about Derbe and then went back. Then in his second journey, he wanted to go back through where they had gone before, but of course he and Barnabas split, had a disagreement there. So Paul and Silas went this way, back through sort of reverse. But then from Antioch in Pisidia, he went this way and went into Macedonia across the sea. We know about in Acts 16 the Macedonian call, where Luke and Paul and some of the others decided they needed to go across the Aegean Sea and head to new territory, to Macedonia, which is here. He went to Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea before he finally traveled to Athens, Greece. So at the end of Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens. Or not at the end, but in the middle, in the beginning of Acts chapter 17, he is in Athens. And he's preaching, and we learned that he was alone when he went to Athens for a while. But he anticipated being reunited with the 2 young men, or one of them was young, we know. We presume the other one was young, Timothy and Silas. He was wanting them to hurry up and come back to him to get reunited. And it was while he was waiting for them that he preached in Athens, and he gave that huge, monumental speech that's one of my favorites because of how powerful it is and how it's so applicable today and so succinct and so to the point. It's such a good example for us in dealing with people who are not God-fearing people, who are not have no religious background, who don't have any foundation. You got to start from the beginning, basically. And that's what Paul does in Acts 17, verses 24 through 31. But that's what's happening when he's in Athens. We get the impression that he didn't have much success there. He was not overly encouraged. But a few people were moved. Others started to mock him and because he mentioned resurrection, and as soon as he said resurrection, he kind of lost some of his audience. But we don't know how long he stayed in Athens, but what we do know is that he eventually left to go to his next place, which was Corinth. So he moved along and he went to Corinth, which is right what we might call, the next town over from Athens. It probably wasn't literally, but, the next big city. And it was a big city, Corinth. It was in Greece. It was the capital of the Roman province called Achaia, which is what we would know of today as Greece. It was a major city in the ancient world. It was very strategically located on a strip of land that connected two other pieces of land. They carved a canal through it so that ships could come through, which made it an incredibly busy place. It was a center of commerce and travel, and that's a pretty good location for a congregation. It also lends itself to having a whole lot of issues because of where it's located. So it's funny how that works sometimes. The things that are so potentially useful for the Lord also are useful for the devil. We see that often, like the internet, for instance, and other things along those lines, TV for that matter. As much as they could be useful for the Lord's work, they're also used by the devil for his work. So the location of a city like Corinth is no exception. It was a lot of people will be coming through there, but also that means a lot of wickedness will be coming through there and probably hanging around there. It had a lot of people. It was estimated that it included about, more than 300,000 citizens and over, 450,000 slaves. So a very large city. It was had a reputation of being a very wicked city, but it was also, like we said, in an ideal location for the gospel. The more people passing through, then if you are able to reach them or contact them or come into contact with them and teach them, and they're converted, guess what they're going to do? By nature, by default, they're going to be taking that wherever they're going or wherever they're coming from, because they'll be moving along. So what we read in Acts chapter 18 is that Paul stayed there for a year and a half. In verse 11, Paul stayed there for a year and a half, and then eventually he would leave Corinth. And sometime later, he received a letter from a woman named Chloe, who was a member of the church in Corinth. And that letter revealed or was to tell Paul that the church there was dealing with some things. There were some problems in the church at Corinth. And that is what led Paul to write the letter that we know of as 1 Corinthians, because there were problems in the church at Corinth. But today we're going to be looking at Paul's time at Corinth as sort of a lead up to the letter of 1 Corinthians. Just, I'll go ahead and say it now so I don't forget. 2 weeks from today is the first day of our gospel meeting, which means we won't be looking at 1 Corinthians during the Bible class period. So next week we'll look at lessons 2 and 3 together, or try to do that to make up for the lesson that we won't be spending in 1 Corinthians. So just file that away. Next week we'll look at the next 2 lessons. So as we said, the topics mentioned that in the letter of 1 Corinthians were really specific to the Corinthian congregation, but that's not to say that they're not things that we can face today. Because, like I said, there are only so many problems, and any congregation could potentially have to deal with these kinds of problems. And so, even though it's almost 2,000 years old, we still today need divine guidance about these things, like unity is a big focal point in 1 Corinthians. Godliness in general, respect for authority, Paul touches on that. Proper conduct in the church, very important. And 1 Corinthians deals with those problems in addition to others. So, as we said, Acts chapter 18. This is when Paul first arrives at Corinth, and here's what we read. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. So that's the beginning of Paul's time at Corinth. He finds, and here's an example of, there are questions we'd like to have answered that we don't really have the answer to. How did he meet this godly man and woman who seem to already have been Christians at this time, even though Aquila is called a Jew, but there's also indication and reason to believe that they were like Paul. Paul was a Jew also in a sense, but he had become a Christian. There's reason to believe that Aquila and Priscilla were like that at this time already. So we're not told how he met them, how he came into contact with them. We're just told that he did. And he stayed with them because they had the same trade. They did the same thing. They worked with leather or canvas, or most versions just say tent makers. That probably stretched to some other things besides just tent making, maybe sails. Some people believe maybe at a place like Corinth, sails for ships would be something that they would be able to do and be a good thing to get into on an isthmus like Corinth was. So he met this man who had the same trade and his wife, godly couple, and that's who he stayed with. Yes, sir. Yeah. So put yourself in Paul's shoes. He's arrived at Corinth. Remember, he's not overly encouraged because he didn't get a whole lot of success in Athens. He arrives at Corinth, maybe a little bit downcast and alone. And there's no church there. This is the first that the gospel has come there with him. With him was the first time the gospel had come to Corinth. So there's no congregation here. What's Paul going to do? Well, we know that every Sabbath he was going to go to the synagogue like he always did. But what about the rest of the week? What is he to do to start, at least while he waits for his companions? It seems that what he decided to do was try to get a job, working in the trade that he was trained to do. That was the way of it. At least for the Jews, we get the impression from almost every example we have. That's what they did. They had whatever their father did is probably what you're going to do. That's why we see James and John, they were fishermen because their father was a fisherman, and then they were trained to be fishermen. Jesus was a carpenter because Joseph was a carpenter. And Paul, we don't know anything about his father, but there's every reason to assume that his father had been a tent maker. So he was trained to be a tent maker. So he goes wherever he needed to go. We have to understand there were usually guilds for trades, like a miner's guild or a tanner's guild, this kind of thing, where there would be a place for you to go. And maybe that's where Paul went, and that's where he met this man, this godly man who was also a kinsman, a countryman of Paul, named Aquila, from Pontus, which Pontus is all the way over here. We're told also here that Aquila and Priscilla were exiled from Rome. So we don't know exactly why. We're just told, when. We're just told that Claudius Claudius had said all the Jews were to be expelled from Rome, and so that's why they're at Corinth. But we're told that he was from Pontus. Oh, here he is. From Rome all the way to Corinth. We talked a lot about the providence of God in Esther. Surely, maybe there's a little bit of providence here. It will be a while before Paul made it to Rome. And he's utterly alone at Corinth. But, against all odds, you might say, Aquila and Priscilla are in Corinth at the time when Paul arrives there. And they were absolutely a tremendous help to him in so many ways as he stayed there. I just want to point out also that verse 4 is very standard for Paul's practice, his custom. Every Sabbath, he went to the synagogue. And what did he do, according to the text? Two things. I mean, it's really one thing, but it's mentioned in two different ways. Okay, he tried. Okay, that's one I wasn't even focusing on in this case. Jews and Greeks, whoever would listen, basically. What did he do to Jews and Greeks, though? Okay, number one, he reasoned. He reasoned with them. What you think that there's significance in that word as opposed? Sure, he preached. He always preached. He always taught. But what is it about reasoning? Okay, usually that's going to involve a back and forth kind of dynamic. Reason. He reasoned with them. He was appealing to their reason, their own reason, which is sort of, it seems to me, contrary to what a lot of people make of teaching. It's not about reason, it's about faith and emotion. So you appeal to their emotions and get them to have faith that is based on your utter lack of understanding, your utter lack of ability, your just utter lack in general, that you trust and have faith in God without any understanding of anything, that He will swoop in and save you or whatever. Paul went into the synagogue and he reasoned. He reasoned with them. And what's the other thing it says? He reasoned with them and he tried to persuade. Yours says persuaded. Okay, some of them just say persuaded. The ESV puts it in a little bit different. Tried to persuade them. So again, persuade and reason, those are two things that are totally different than just he went there and said Jesus is the Son of God, whether you like it or not, and if you want to be saved, you have to trust in Him and believe Him, the end. He reasoned with them. And other places we read how he proved to them by the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. You see, so he used the Scriptures to show them, I can show you with our own Scriptures, which would mean the Old Testament in this context, because the New Testament hadn't been written or completed yet. I can show you that Jesus is the Christ. The Christ we've been waiting for, it's Jesus of Nazareth. And I can prove it. So he reasoned with them back and forth. Maybe they had questions. And he had answers. He would respond to them back and forth. We should take his example here in that reasoning and trying to persuade. And I like how it says he tried to persuade, because he didn't always persuade, but he always tried to persuade both Jews and Greeks. So the next thing then we read is Silas and Timothy. So we saw Aquila and Priscilla. Now verses 5 and 6 says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus, or yours might say that Jesus was the Christ, which is more natural to the way we would say it probably. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. So, Silas and Timothy finally got there. Finally arrived. from Macedonia. We're not told exactly where Silas had been. I had another map here. Got my slides out of order. I'm going to go ahead and fix that. Silas, we're told, was in Macedonia. That's the closest we get to an explanation of where he had been. But we don't know exactly where he was, but it is believed that he was in Thessalonica for a time, and then that Paul had sent Timothy to Philippi, or somewhere in that region, Thessalonica, and Silas may have been at a nearby place, and Paul was still alone while he was in Athens. But now, when he was in Athens, they came to him and he sent them back to Macedonia. Then he went to Corinth alone, and finally they arrived from there so that they were all together at Corinth. So now they're all back together, and what was Paul doing? He was still doing the same thing. But in this case, there's a new thing mentioned. It says that when they arrived from Macedonia, he was occupied with the word. Now, in the context of the first few verses, it seems that what we're reading here is that after they arrived, it could go either way. It could mean that when they arrived, he was already occupied with the word, or that because they arrived, he was able to be occupied with the word. But either way, what it seems to suggest is that he was solely occupied with the word. He was no longer spending more of his days doing his trade, but that he was able to be predominantly or exclusively occupied with the word, which means he was preaching. He was spending all his time preaching, is basically what we're reading here. And based on other scripture, it seems that it was because Silas and Timothy arrived, because Paul told the Corinthians, if you remember, if you were in our study of 2 Corinthians just on Wednesday nights over the last several weeks, he told the Corinthians that the churches in Macedonia actually supported him while he was in Corinth. So he explicitly refused to take money from the Corinthians while he was there. But instead, the churches of Macedonia supported him financially while he was in Corinth. So in part, he supported himself, and then in part, he was supported by churches in Macedonia. So it seems that Silas and Timothy not only brought good news from Macedonia, they also brought money to help him in his ministry. Yeah, Dean?
Well, if they did, bring the money, that would mean that would free him up. He wouldn't have to be working with his hands and trade. That would free that part up.
Yeah.
Now, he got some extra money to be able to go ahead and do the preaching that he needed to do.
Yeah. Yep, it allowed him to spend more of his time doing that, which is, that's we can understand that. Sometimes there may be a congregation that the preacher also works outside the church, and there may be, if the church is able to fully support him, the idea is he won't have to do that, so he can spend his time being occupied with the word. So that's how that works. But whenever we pair this with other testimony, like 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, when he told the Thessalonians, since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you, but Satan hindered us. This is talking about when he had to leave Thessalonica to go to for his own safety, which is when he went to Athens, and then after he was done in Athens, he went on to Corinth. But then he said, therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy to establish and exhort you in your faith. That's why we know Timothy was sent to Thessalonica at the time when Paul had gone to Corinth. So, again, we don't know where he sent Silas because he didn't tell us, but we know he sent Timothy to Thessalonica. Now, back to Acts 18. Actually, we're not even ready for these verses yet. But verse 6 says, when they opposed and reviled him, well, who's they? Well, we have to back up a little bit. We know that verse 4 said that he was trying to persuade Jews and Greeks, but in verse 5 it explicitly specifies the Jews. He was testifying to the Jews, and when they opposed him and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, fine, I'm paraphrasing now, fine, I'm going to the Gentiles. That's exactly what he and Barnabas already did in another city, but this was his practice. This kind of shows us that in Acts chapter 13, verse 46 and following, when they made that declaration, maybe for the first time or first recorded time, that it was necessary that the word of God be spoken to you first, but since you thrust it from yourself, we're going to the Gentiles. That wasn't a once and for all thing, because he still, and when he got to a new city, he still started with the Jews every time. But every time when the Jews opposed and reviled him, he said, now I'm going to the Gentiles in this city. Now I'm going to focus solely on the Gentiles. So now, once again, that's happened at Corinth. The Jews, as a rule, rejected the gospel, rejected that Jesus was the Christ, the thing of which he was trying to persuade them. They rejected it. They didn't want to hear it. On top of that, they opposed Paul and mocked him, reviled him, spoke against him is what that means. The word in the Greek is blasphemed, but it's not talking about they blasphemed God. It means they spoke against Paul. They reviled him. And so he said, okay, fine. I'm innocent of your blood. I'm innocent of your souls, for that matter. I'm going to the Gentiles. I tried. Now I'm going to the Gentiles.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So I know that the Sadducees and Pharisees had this view of who the Christ was supposed to be. Like he's supposed to be a warrior and all that stuff. Was that widely held among all Jews because of how they were taught? Or was it more of a, like you said, some of them where the resurrection was talked about, they were just, away. Was it because of the view of who Christ was supposed to be, or was it just mainly on the belief of the resurrection?
Well, for the first part, it seems that it was widely held among pretty much all Jews about not necessarily who the Messiah would be personally, but the kind of Messiah he was going to be. Because even the apostles they didn't get it either. So they never really gave an indication that they thought he was going to be this David-like figure. But they did give an indication they didn't understand. That they believed in Jesus, they believed he was the Christ, but they in their minds couldn't understand, for lack of a better word, they couldn't understand how he was because he was so different. And the kingdom that they didn't see anything happening that they thought should accompany his coming. So the fact that they didn't get it either leads us to maybe assume that it wasn't just the Pharisees, it was all the Jews that believed that. And that may be in part because the Pharisees and the other Jewish establishment taught that to everybody. As far as the Sadducees or the resurrection aspect goes, it was what that would have done for a lot of people is, regardless of anything else you say about this Jesus, and what kind of Lord or what kind of Messiah the Christ will be, it can't be Jesus because he's dead. So that's it would be kind of like that, where, okay, so you think the Messiah is going to be a spiritual king, he's going to establish a spiritual kingdom or a heavenly kingdom, and so on and so forth. But the one thing that you can't deny is that Jesus is dead, or that at least that he died. So it can't be him because he died, and if he died, he's still dead because there's no such thing as coming back from the dead. So
no proof that resurrection could ever happen.
Yeah, they claim that, which is strange because there are at least 2 instances in the Old Testament where there was somebody raised from the dead. So it's interesting that they were so certain. Probably because the Sadducees, as a rule, were the much more liberal party, and they probably didn't put a whole lot of stock in the Scriptures, the text of the Scriptures at all anyway. And that's why the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagreed on resurrection, because the Pharisees did. They didn't get it right, but they at least, in theory, respected the text. Yeah, Dean?
I think mostly all the Jews, even some of the other nations, they were all looking for a Messiah. Regardless of their different creeds, their different religious organizations. I think they all, just like today, even with the different denominations, they all believe in Christ. But there's, they have of their belief in Christ, where we know that Christ, he was the true Messiah. But yet, and we know that the Jews, and especially when Jesus was teaching to the Samaritan woman, they were looking for the Messiah too.
Yeah.
Because those were part Jews and Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just it. I think they all the Jews were looking for the Messiah because it was promised to the Jews. But yet, like you said, all the Jews had different ideas of what he was supposed to be. So some of them thought that he's going to set up the kingdom again, the physical kingdom, and reign here on this earth. But that was what God wanted in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah, they just, that was the main dividing difference from a practical standpoint between the Jews and the Gentiles, or the Greeks, however you want to put it. It's usually synonymous. Two classes of people, Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles. The difference was the Jews pretty much unanimously believed in the Messiah as a real thing, a real one who was coming, whereas the Gentiles they were not raised up under the law of Moses and in the scriptures, and therefore they had to be taught from a totally different beginning point, which is why when Paul went to the synagogue, he didn't go to the synagogue and try to persuade them that there is one God who made the world and everything in it, like he did in Athens. He would go to the synagogue and try to persuade them. He also wouldn't go and try to persuade them that a Messiah was coming, that God was going to send a Messiah to save the world. He went there to persuade them that the Christ was Jesus. You see that? So that was his main focal point. Everything else they already understood, that there is one God, that God created the universe and everything in it, that God was going to send a Savior, an anointed one, a Messiah. But Paul needed to persuade them that it's Jesus. Jesus is him. He didn't succeed all the time, and he didn't succeed in Corinth with a lot of them, some of them. The Jews did not accept this. They opposed and reviled him. One other thing very quickly, some versions in verse 5 say, you might have the word spirit there, like he was constrained by the Spirit. The better manuscripts say word there. I forgot that part to mention that. The text isn't saying that he was constrained by the Spirit, but he was occupied with the Word. Logos is the word there. Now, what is left to interpretation a little bit is whether it should be in the passive voice or the middle voice, which in Greek the middle voice means he occupied himself with the Word, or if it's in the passive. But at the end of the day, it has the same meaning. He was solely dedicated to preaching the Word, either by the time Silas and Timothy got there, or because Silas and Timothy got there. Where do you think Paul got the idea to shake out his garments whenever the Jews rejected his teaching? Yeah, Jesus, he wasn't there. Paul wasn't there. But obviously, this was a principle that he was taught or told by the Lord, or he got it from some common practice, because that's exactly what Jesus told the apostles to do whenever he sent them out on what we call the limited commission. Those who hear you, abide in the house and put your blessing on the house. But those who don't hear your words and don't receive you, shake the dust off your feet, he says, and move on, and pronounce against them, and then go somewhere else. So that's what Paul did with the Jews whenever they rejected him. He shook off his garment, which was a symbolic gesture. It was a gesture of, I'm shaking you off, basically. And it's not, no guilt or anything will cling to me. I'm innocent of this because I tried. Yes?
Well, the thing is, they did a lot of the walk, and it was dust on the road where they went. So there would be a lot of people, that they had to substitute washing the people's feet because of the fact that, they had sandals and stuff like that. Well, your feet going to get dirty if you're walking on the ground, especially with the sandals. Feet is bound to get dirt, and that's what they use the expression to do that. where it's, just symbolic.
Yeah.
It didn't, actually, completely, like, just symbolic of doing what Jesus would.
Yeah, it was a gesture that was specifically designed to be shaking them off. Like this particular village that doesn't receive your word, that doesn't accept you and welcome you and want you there, to shake off it's like shaking off their dust. This is the dust of your village, your place. I'm shaking it off, and I'm going somewhere else. And it's no fault of his or any other preacher or teacher. If somebody rejects them because of their teaching, move on. We'll see a little bit more on that later this morning. So he moves on then, or he has to move on a little bit. He's still in Corinth, but it says he left there, being the synagogue. So he's done with the synagogue now, and the Jews. He left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, or Justus, who's called a worshiper of God, whose house just happened to be right next door to the synagogue. So that's convenient. This man named Justus. And then also we read Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Now we see the beginning of the church at Corinth. If not before, of course, like I said, we're not sure about Aquila and Priscilla. Maybe they were already Christians. Maybe they would become Christians, but we don't get the impression that Paul converted them. We kind of get the impression that they were already Christians before Paul ever met them. In that case, you could almost say they were sort of the beginning of the church at Corinth. But if nothing else, here is the beginning. This man, Justus, who seems to have been maybe a Jewish proselyte, or maybe he was like Cornelius, and that's why he's called a worshiper of God instead of maybe some other term. But Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue. Now, if Paul was discouraged before, this is probably a big encouragement. That's a big deal. The ruler of the synagogue is converted to Christ with his whole household, and then many Corinthians in addition. So now there is officially, for lack of a better word, a congregation of the Lord's church in the city of Corinth. Justus, maybe Aquila and Priscilla, Justus, Crispus, and the household of Crispus, and whoever these other many were. But there is an important point here in verse 8. It's sort of like a summary, but it's still very telling. It says, the Corinthians, they heard Paul, they believed what Paul was saying, and they were baptized. Which is, in short, that's the plan of salvation. Of course, there's no repentance mentioned here. It's implied. There's no confession mentioned here. It's more or less implied. But they heard, they believed, they were baptized. And it's the same for anybody else. And this is where we read that, well, actually, we'll keep reading. The Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. For I have many in this city who are my people." And he stayed 1 year and 6 months teaching the word of God among them. So maybe Paul was a little bit apprehensive, or maybe he was worried to some extent. And the Lord came in a vision and said, "You sit tight," or not sit tight, you stay and teach, preach, keep doing what you're doing. No one's you're safe. You don't have to worry about that. Besides, there are many people here who are going to listen, who will heed you. Sure, there have been many who didn't, but there are still many who will. That's what he meant when he said, "I have many in this city who are my people." Their hearts were right, and they would believe and obey. Yes, sir.
Paul's past made it more difficult for him in the start because he thought the church was against him.
Yeah.
I mean, people didn't forget that, I'm sure.
I'm sure they didn't, yeah. He did.
No,
And
And it made it more difficult, I'm sure,
yeah,
to get people to follow him.
yeah, it may have, especially, the further east you went, where he did that. The people in Corinth probably didn't know about it, but the Jews may have. The word can spread pretty quickly, even in 2,000 years ago. Word can spread more quickly than we might think. So he had plenty of obstacles. You know what? Everybody who tries to teach the truth has obstacles. That somewhere there will be some kind of obstacle, and even with Paul. And so no matter what, you're going to have some kind of obstacle. This is I think the only time that we read about the Lord having to step in, and so to speak, and tell Paul, keep going here. We know that if Paul left Corinth, he would still be preaching wherever he went. But he specifically tells him to keep preaching here, because the Lord knows there are people in the city that will obey the gospel. But in order for that to happen, they have to hear the gospel. In order for that to happen, Paul's got to stick around and preach, because at this time, there wasn't really anybody else that was going to do that. And, that's a lesson for us today in itself, that we don't always know who the people are that will obey the gospel, that will believe and obey, but they're out there, and we need to do everything we can to try to reach them. Yeah, Dean?
Well, we know that previously in Acts, where Paul, he was fleeing from his life. So, and he might have even feel what, sooner or later he'd have to flee from Corinth because of the fact, he had to flee these other cities. But here we see that God is reassuring Paul that he had the people there that did believe in God, and he didn't have to worry about that. That was one thing that Paul didn't have to worry about, like he did in the other Thessalonica and all those other cities where he had to flee, and all that. He had to flee for his life, but here, God is reassuring him that that's one thing less on his mind than he had to worry about.
Yep. And he listened, and he did exactly what the Lord told him. That's why Luke records here, Luke who wrote the book of Acts, that he stayed there a year and a half. So the Lord said, stay, keep going, keep preaching. He stayed for a whole year and a half. And it may have been, helpful after the fact. We don't really know how much. I don't think it's safe to assume that a year and a half separates verses 11 from verse 12, but we don't know exactly how much time, but it eventually we read that the Jews made a united attack on Paul. So this is obviously more than just opposing him and reviling him. Now they've gone farther. And this might have been a time when Paul would have said, okay, this is the time for me to leave. But maybe because of that vision, he knew, no, it's not time to leave yet. Even though this is happening, I've already been reassured by the Lord, and so I'm gonna stick it out. So we won't even get into that because we're pretty much out of time. Their attack didn't work, but there are lessons we learn. Don't overestimate how, as Paul was at Corinth throughout the whole time, he was surrounded by fellow Christians, fellow believers. At first, it was Aquila and Priscilla. Then Silas and Timothy came back. Then Justus and Crispus, and then several others who believed and obeyed. We get this idea of community and fellowship and mutual encouragement. Hebrews 3:12 and 13 says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any one of you an evil unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." Exhort one another every day. Every day. Don't separate yourself from Christian companionship. Number 2, Paul's time in Corinth is indicative of what he did throughout his life, preaching to the Jews and Gentiles, focusing primarily on Jesus as the Christ, trying to persuade them, reasoning with them, which again takes a lot more effort and preparation than just preaching, one point. But number 3, I kind of separated these into 2 points from our book. The summary of how Christians respond to the gospel is important, like we already pointed out. They heard the word, just like Romans 10:17 says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. They believed the word, Hebrews 11:6, and they were baptized. And when they were baptized into Jesus' death, they contacted his blood that he poured out for the sins of the world, as a ransom for many. They were washed, sanctified, and justified. He tells them in chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians. And, for us today and anybody today, it's the same. It will always be the same. The plan of salvation, the way to obtain and contact the blood that Jesus poured out for the sins of the world is to obey his plan of salvation. And we read that every time we read of anybody being saved, we read about it being done in the same way. And it's still the same to this day.